Welcome AP Environmental Science students to this PowerPoint on soil formation and erosion. This covers topic 4.2, soil formation and erosion. It looks pretty bare, it looks pretty simple, but there is a lot to unpack here. Okay, so again, we're with this same enduring understanding, Earth systems interact, resulting in a state of balance over time. Again, that word balance we've talked about before, but the learning objective described the characteristics and formation of soil. Vocab I will skip as usual, but you can pause this now and write it all down. So getting right into it, soil. Soil is probably one of the least celebrated natural resources that we have on the planet. Soil is probably one of the most important natural resources that we have, and people don't talk about soil nearly as much as I think that they should. Being a gardener, soil is one of my obsessions, and increasing the fertility of my little patch of earth is one of my obsessions. So what is soil? Soil is a complex mixture of minerals, rocks, organic matter, gases, liquids, and organisms that all support life. Okay, all of that is necessary to support life. You need the minerals for plants to take up. The rocks are providing those minerals as those rocks weather away. The organic matter provides habitat and provides food resources for fungi and bacteria, all the beneficial microbes in the soil, as well as earthworms and beneficial macroorganisms, large organisms. Gases, soils should have gases in that matrix and that three-dimensional matrix of soil. So we're talking about atmospheric gases that are getting down into the soil. You need oxygen for the earthworms. You need carbon dioxide. You need, the different gases in the atmosphere. Liquids, primarily water and everything that water has dissolved. And then again, those organisms that are going to support the life. There's 4 functions of soil. It's a medium for plant growth. Plants take up nutrients from the soil, they take up water out of the soil, and they need it for growth. They also anchor plants as well, so that's getting down to this habitat part. They store, purify, and supply water. We talked about that a little bit when we talked about watersheds, and we'll talk about it more when we talk about the water cycle. They regulate the Earth's atmosphere. This is what we call an ecosystem service. Something that we have not talked about yet in this class, but is coming up. So an ecosystem service, that's regulating the Earth's atmosphere. So we're talking about the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycles, and again, habitat for the organisms that are in the soil and living on the soil. And soils are going to change over time. They're going to change over time due to geologic factors, due to topography of the landscape, due to climatic factors and biological factors, and all of that is going to take a great deal of time. So soils form from parent material, and parent material is typically going to be your bedrock. Your bedrock is consolidated solid rock, but it could be from any of these other sources. It could be river alluvium, lake or marine sediments, volcanic ash, or glacial tills, but we're going to stick with bedrock because that is the most common. And it's typically going to be freshly exposed bedrock. So bedrock that has freshly been exposed to weathering action from any of rain, wind, sunlight, or biologic factors that can start to weather that rock. Okay, the chemical composition of that bedrock or any of the other parent material sources is going to ultimately affect the chemical composition of that soil that it begins to form. Okay, it's also going to affect some physical properties like texture and the porosity of that soil. All right. So as that parent material is exposed, it's going to be exposed to rain, it's going to be exposed to sun, it's going to be exposed to wind, it's going to be exposed to chemicals in the environment, mostly, water dissolving minerals in the rock, some of those minerals reacting with each other. It's going to be exposed to biological action as well, so lichens, earthworms, roots of plants that are going to start to break down that soil. Okay, that broken down parent material is not only going to weather, but is also going to erode, and we'll talk about the differences between those a little bit later. All right. So as that parent material is breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces to start to form the soil, there are several factors that can affect that. One of those is topography. And topography is the form and features of the land surface. Are we talking about a flat landscape, or are we talking about hills and mountains like what we have up here in this picture? Okay, the elevation of an area is going to affect how that parent material breaks down and the soils that it forms. We don't have to get too much into the details with that, but essentially higher elevations are typically going to be colder, less vegetated, and that's going to affect both the biological and the hydrological processes that happen there. The aspect, the north or south facing slope, you guys live in Colorado, so you know that on the south slope, you typically get the sunlight hitting that. And on the north slope, you typically are shaded. So the south slope is typically going to be dry. It's going to be thin soils. There's not going to be as much vegetation because the sun's beating down on it all the time. Whereas on the north slope, you'll typically get lots and lots of trees and other vegetation growing on that. All of that organic matter is going to form deep soil. You're going to have less evaporation, which is going to be moister soils with more organic matter in it. So the aspect can definitely influence soil formation and the characteristics of that soil. The slope, are we talking about a gentle or a steep slope? Right here at this cliff face, we're going to have very, very little soil because any soil that does form is just going to erode right off the cliff face down the side of this mountain, right? So we're going to, once it gets into this shallower slope, we're going to have more and more soil build up. We're going to have that parent material breaking, or we're going to have the soil from that broken down parent material forming deeper and deeper soils as it breaks off of the very steep slopes up here. Okay. The slope configuration is a convex or concave. Essentially, are we looking at something that's like that with a mountain, or are we looking at something that is like this, right? Something that both of those are going to result in maybe thicker soils at the flatter areas and thinner soils at the more steep areas. All right. The relative position of the slopes, so are we talking about the bottom or the top of the mountain? Soils are going to be very thin up at the top of the mountain. They're going to be very thick down at the valley floor. And again, all of those are going to affect the hydrologic factors, including the amount of precipitation, the rate of runoff, the rate of evaporation, and as well as the formation of ice in those areas. Okay. The major players with all this: water, gravity, and sun exposure. So some ways that topography affects human settlements in mountainous areas. All right, so we have one picture and one diagram. This one on the left looks like it's from rice paddies in East or Southeast Asia, and you notice that they have terraced this landscape, so we'll talk about that when we talk about erosion a little bit later, and they are controlling water by doing that. They're creating all these flat areas where water can sit and pool in these rice paddies rather than just run down the side of the hill. But what it looks like they have going right down the center of this is a river or a creek. They have created their settlement down there at the bottom of this landscape. This is a bowl-shaped convex landscape, and it's bringing that concave landscape, my bad. So a bowl-shaped concave landscape where they have that flat area down at the bottom on either side of this bowl, and it is channeling water down towards their settlement. Over here on the right, we are looking at a diagram of a settlement in the Northern Hemisphere, where we have the Northern Hemisphere winter, the Northern Hemisphere summer positions of sun, and they have these different areas of where they are going to have their vegetation and the different types of vegetation and the settlement that they have, right? So their settlement is going to be at the south-facing slope, so that it has direct access to sunlight, especially during the winter, to heat up those homes. Down here at the bottom of the valley, they have the thickest soils, so it's going to be growing your hay, your fruit, and your cereals. Cereals meaning grain. The same thing down here. Your thickest soils are going to be down here where those people have settled. All right. They have trees growing on the north slope. They have trees growing up at the top of the south slope as well. So all of that is influenced by the relative topography or the topography of this landscape. So climate, how is climate going to affect soils? So again, precipitation and sunlight are going to be the main players here. Water is going to erode rock. Erosion is basically moving rock or particles of soil from one place and depositing them in another. In these gullies on the top right, we have soil particles from up here moving down to the valley through the process of erosion being carried by water. Okay. Water is also going to dissolve a lot of chemicals, and it acts as a solvent for those chemicals, and all of those chemicals, or at least many of those chemicals, can react with one another in that solution. Okay, so many of those chemical weathering processes have to happen in water because water is going to initially dissolve those chemicals. Some of those chemicals can leach out of the soil. We'll talk about what leaching is in a little bit. And then we have freeze and thaw action. This is only going to happen in areas where you do have water freezing, but freeze and thaw action is diagrammed here on the bottom right, where we have a boulder and water is going to collect in a little pool at the top of this boulder. And then as water freezes, you know that it expands. So water will get into that little crack and it will freeze and it will expand and widen that crack. Water is very, very, very powerful when it does freeze and expand, so it's enough to break rock. So it widens that crack a little bit, and that crack is now deeper, so more water can be held, and then that water freezes and that crack widens until eventually that rock is going to split. So we see a picture of that where that crack, that split rock is evidence of freeze-thaw action. And the solar energy. The solar energy is going to determine the rate of evaporation. So is your soil going to be moist or is it going to be dry? Again, in Colorado and the mountains here, if you are on the south slope, your soils are typically going to be very dry. They're going to be very thin, and they're going to support very little vegetation compared to the north slope. Sorry, I was thinking W for wet. Where the north slope is going to be very wet, the north slope is going to have lots of water in the soil because the rate of evaporation is very low, and you're going to have much more vegetation on the north slope. Okay. Solar energy does facilitate plant growth. Again, if something is totally shaded, you're going to have different types of plants growing there, which can affect that soil versus whether it is totally barren with no soil, or sorry, with no plants whatsoever because it's too hot, say a desert. Any type of plant growth is going to affect that soil. So the amount of organic matter in it specifically. And then solar energy can chemically affect soils. It can chemically alter soils through photolytic reactions, just reactions with sunlight. There's a few ways that living organisms can influence soil formation. The first is primary succession. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the semester, but primary succession is essentially starting with bare rock and through biologic action getting soil at the end. Obviously, chemical and photolytic action is going to play into this as well, but it's mostly biological. Starts with lichens, and lichens are a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. A fungus and an algae. There's actually new research coming out to say that there's a third partner in that, which is a yeast, which is another type of fungus. But anyway, the fungus will typically break down the rock in order to get minerals for the algae and the fungus to live. The algae will photosynthesize and provide the fungus with sugars. All right. As these fungi break down the rock, they break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, which contributes to soil formation. Plus, these things die and the organic remains add organic matter to the soil, which builds up the soil as well. So they're really the first stage of soil formation. After the soil is thick enough, you'll have flowering plants and grasses move into that area, and then they'll further build up that soil with organic matter. Some other actions after we have primary succession, we'll have fungi that break down the parent material into soil. So that happens still even after we have thick soil. There's still fungi that are breaking down that parent material. Plant roots, animal burrows, earthworms can all aerate the soil that they move through. They can all break down the organic matter in it as well, or at least the earthworms are breaking down the organic matter. Everything else is just aerating it. Animals that trample the soil can compact it, so that influences the soil properties as well. Compact soils don't absorb water, for instance, so water tends to run off of compact soils. Some plants can chemically alter the soil, so a great example of that are pine trees that can lower the pH of the soil, making it more acidic. And then large tree roots can crack rock, especially if that soil is pretty thin. And then all of this notwithstanding, time is a huge process in this. We need a lot of time to build up soils, anywhere from hundreds to thousands to even millions of years. All right, so that was all a broad overview of how we make soils. So again, just to recap very quickly, soils are made from breaking down that parent material into smaller and smaller pieces and then adding organic matter to it. Okay, there's a lot of factors that influence that, everything from topography to climate to biology. But once we have soil, then we can start to differentiate it into horizons. Horizons are horizontal layers of soil that each have their own properties. Okay. Before we get into that, a couple more vocab terms: humus and leaching. Humus is brown or black organic matter that's in that soil. It's partially decomposed, mostly decomposed plant and animal material. It is basically the organic portion of the soil. Okay. Whenever you see dark soils, it is very high in humus. The dark color, the brown or black, as long as you're not dealing with black lava rock, pretty much everything else is due to humus, okay? It's very nutrient rich, meaning that it is good soil. When you see black soil, that is the best soil. I wish I had black soil in my garden, like what they have in, I don't know, Iowa or something like that. Okay, very high in humus, lots of organic matter that is supporting a huge array of soil microorganisms, most of which are beneficial to your plants and help your plants out. Okay, so it's partially decomposed organic matter. Leaching, this is a unrelated process. It is the process of water dissolving anything that's water soluble in that soil. Say that water rains, I'll do it in blue. Say that water rains on this soil. It starts to, infiltrate down into that soil, and it starts to dissolve anything that's organic, or sorry, anything that is water soluble, my bad. Anything that's water soluble in that. And just like everything else, it's influenced by gravity, so that water moves down and down into the soil, or through the soil, I should say, through all the nooks and crannies, and it takes all of the water soluble nutrients there with it into the bottom layers. Okay, so that's why this layer is light colored, because it has all the good stuff leached out of it. Okay, so water falls onto the soil, absorbs water soluble materials, or dissolves water soluble materials and carries them down into the soil column. So our soil horizons, the top soil horizon is the O horizon. This is at the surface, and it's dead organic matter. Okay, it's dead leaves, dead branches, animal remains, fecal matter, anything that is organic matter on the surface. Okay, pine needles, etc. It's going to be very high in humus because all of that organic matter is decomposing. It is actively decomposing in that top layer. And you might even have some layers within the O horizon where, say that you have like fresh leaves on the top and then partially decomposed leaves before that or underneath of that. So decomposed, and then, pretty much you're fully decomposed, great humus right below that, and all of that is making up the O horizon, and then you have the A underneath of it. Okay, it can be variable thickness, so think about a deciduous forest in the Appalachian Mountains. It could be very, very thick O horizon with many years of dead leaves all decomposing right there in the O horizon, or it could be totally absent. Sahara Desert does not have an O horizon. Okay, very, very thin, if not completely absent. Okay, so O is for organic. It's all the organic stuff at the surface. All right. The A horizon, this is some of your mineral matter, so some of your parent material that has broken down over time, mixing with that organic matter up here and creating this A horizon. So it's typically dark, it's typically high in organic matter, so high in humus and high in minerals. Okay, it's really, really fertile. If we take the two of those together, those are the topsoil. So the O plus the A is the topsoil. Okay, so O plus A is topsoil. And topsoil is great stuff. Topsoil is what your vegetable plants are typically growing in. Your crop plants are typically growing in topsoil. Their roots, think about like a tomato or something, does not have a deep root system. So you have the stem of the plant and then you have its roots going down into the A horizon, maybe a little bit down into the E, but mostly just sticking with the A horizon. Okay, so that's where all of the plants that you're growing for crops, especially your annuals, are getting their nutrients from and their water. Trees can definitely dig their roots deeper, so they can go, all the way down to the C horizon into almost to the R. But tree roots can go very deep. You can have certain plants like perennial grasses that also go very deep. But in general, your crops are going to be shallow rooted because most of them are annuals and they're only going to be growing in the topsoil. Okay, so it's really a valuable resource if we think about having to feed 7.98 billion people on the planet. Your topsoil is what you are using to feed all of those people, and it's a huge, huge, huge resource on the planet. Okay. Underneath of the A horizon, you may have an E horizon. Okay, so the E horizon is part of the A horizon. It's the oldest part of the A horizon, and it is where most of the good stuff has been leached out. Okay, so if we think about this O horizon being built up every single year with new organic matter, breaking down into the A horizon, and the A horizon getting thicker and thicker and thicker every year from the organic matter, the stuff at the bottom has been is the oldest, and it's been exposed to water leaching out the minerals out of it for a very, very long time, years, decades, centuries. Okay, so we have water that gets into the soil and it moves down, again, taking anything water soluble with it into the lower layers. Okay, so because this E horizon is the oldest part of the A, it has had all of the good stuff, all the water soluble nutrients dissolved out of it. It's very light colored because there's very little organic matter, and it is basically devoid of nutrients. Okay, it's so distinct at this point that it is no longer part of the A, it is its own horizon. The E horizon is kind of your optional horizon. It may or may not be there depending on the local conditions of that area, specifically the rate of soil formation and the amount of rainfall that is present. The B horizon is typically a lot of clays that have been transported from above. Clay has a very small particle size, so it can move with the water through all the nooks and crannies of the soil and get deposited here. So it's going to be high in clay. It's going to be lighter because there's less humus because it's so far from the top, but it's going to be high in minerals. Okay, so if trees get their roots down there, it's going to be high in minerals. Okay, so the trees do need those. And it is, again, going to be high in clay. The B horizon is typically referred to as subsoil. You won't see that term in this class, at least very often, but if you do, it's subsoil. And then if we take the O, the A, the E, and the B, all of those are what we consider true soil. Once we get down to the C horizon, this is just large pieces of partially eroded parent material, so large pieces of rock, plus all of the clays and sands that have gotten in between those layers. Very little, if any, organic matter. Maybe some tree roots that have gotten all the way down there and rotted, but that's about it. All right, and then your R horizon, that is the bedrock down below. Okay, this is just speaking in generalizations. This is just a broad overview. There's going to be a lot of specific horizons for specific soil types. There's going to be transition zones between all of these. There's going to be subcategories for these horizons, but we don't need to get into any of that for this class. Okay, we just need to know the general basics. All right, so a couple ways to remember this. If we are talking about the O horizon, O is organic, so it's going to be your organic layer. All right, and then we start up with the alphabet. So we start from the top down, A, and then we're interrupted a little bit already in our alphabet with the E. Again, the E is optional, so I'm going to put brackets around it. And the E stands for alluviation, so the zone of alluviation. And alluviation is, at least for this class, you can kind of think of as a synonym for leaching, but it's distinct. But think E for leaching, that second letter in leaching. Okay. Then we get back to the alphabet with B and C, and then finally R for rock. Okay. And we can see that if we look at these soils over here. So we have our O horizon, we have our A horizon, we have our E horizon, and then I'm going to think that all of that is B. Over here we have O, A. I'm not really seeing an E, but maybe this is the E right here. And then we got maybe our B horizon, our C horizon with all of that, and then finally our bedrock down below. All right, you'll notice that there is several different layers here. There is a lot of transitional zones. That looks distinct from that to me. I'm not really a soil expert besides the O or the topsoil, but there's several different layers in all of that, right? And they correspond to different subcategories of the B, C, and the B and C horizons. All right, but in general, this is what you guys need to know. O, A, E, B, C, R. So one side note about soil and water. We talked about how soils filter water when we talked about watersheds. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but soils do filter out water a lot. Okay, so this little diagram on the right, each layer acts as a filter, blocking particulate matter, allowing fresh water to return to aquifers. You have water raining down on this soil, and it will seep through this soil and it will pick up water-soluble nutrients, but anything else is going to be taken out of that. And in fact, most of the water-soluble nutrients or anything that's water-soluble is going to react with other things, precipitate out, and eventually you're going to get down here into your aquifer, and it's going to be relatively clean water. Okay, water or soils basically act as a sieve, so they act as a physical straining mechanism to filter that water. Clays and sands are going to react with a lot of those dissolved substances, especially your clays, and it's going to, again, clean out that water as it brings that water down into the aquifer, so you're going to have relatively clean water in that aquifer. Some minerals are going to remain in it. You're going to have some dissolved minerals in that water in the aquifer, but for the most part, it's going to be very clean. Right. If it doesn't get to an aquifer, maybe it gets diverted by impermeable rock. Say this rock is impermeable to water and it gets diverted into surface water. It's also going to clean that. Like say that this is a hill and then you have a spring right here. And that water is going to flow out of that spring. Going to be very clean water. Okay, maybe not necessarily clean enough to drink, but probably clean enough to drink. So probably the biggest threat to soils around the planet is erosion. I would say the next biggest threat to soils is pollution, but we're going to focus on erosion for the rest of this PowerPoint. Okay, so erosion is any process that removes rock or soil particles from one area and deposits them in another. Okay, say that we have soil right here at the top of this little hill, and then it rains, and you can see that that rain carries that soil through this little gully and deposits that soil down here on this concrete pad. Okay, so it has moved that soil. All right, same thing is happening here on the right. We already talked about that. It's typically going to be done by wind or water. All right, disturbed soils especially should be protected from erosion, but really all soils should be protected from erosion. Okay, the layers of soil that are the most susceptible to erosion are the topsoil layers, and they're also the most fertile. Again, these are a natural resource, so we want to keep those, and we do not want those to erode away. Right? So the loss of topsoil is going to result in a loss of soil fertility, meaning that your plants are not going to grow as well as they would before. And it could be so extreme as to cause something like a dust bowl-like scenario or desertification. And desertification is the process by which fertile soils become increasingly arid, so increasingly more desert-like. And that could be due to natural processes like climate change. For example, the Sahara used to be a relatively fertile grassland, and it used to be just like sub-Saharan Africa is today, but now it is a desert. That was due to natural causes and natural shifts in climate, and that desertified that area. But it could be due to anthropogenic effects, such as the overexploitation of those soils or the erosion of those soils. Okay, and then any soils that lose their topsoils will take a very long time to recover that fertility, typically generations, if not centuries. So some examples of erosion, we have two examples at the top of wind erosion. So on the left, we have a large dust storm. That wind is picking dust off of this very, very dry ground, bringing it up into the air and transporting it from one place to another. On the right, we can see the effects of that, and this is from Arches National Park in Utah, where that sandstone rock has been carved out by wind and it has been eroded down by wind. The three examples on the bottom are due to water. So the one on the left is in a field of crops. We have what looks like maybe the camera angle is tilted, but we have two slight hills. And as this rains in this field, we have water going down these two hills and meeting in the center. And in the center, it is creating a little rivulet, and that has transported out all of that material that you see missing, forming these banks, right? All of this was material, topsoil that was there and is now gone, or at least moved further downstream. Same thing is happening here in the middle, a little bit more natural of a process. As long as this isn't a human disturbed area, it looks like a relatively natural area to me. And then on the right, we have erosion due to wave action. So it also happens due to water from the oceans or large lakes where you have large storms coming in and just gravity, right? This is a sheer cliff. So gravity is just going to take this material and draw it down. So both the waves, the storms, and probably the tides, but then also gravity is a huge one as well. And I always love to see the houses right here. Maybe the shoreline was way over here when these people built, but if you see a cliff like this and you see the evidence of the erosion down here, definitely don't buy that house. That is a very bad idea because that house is eventually going to be down there. So to get back to desertification a little bit, I have an example here on the left where we have Lake Chad, which is in north central Africa. And we see what Lake Chad looked like in 1973 and then progressing to 2001. Note the size of the water. So all of this was water in 1973, and you can see the reduction of that lake. The red might be a red algae, I'm not sure, or it might be vegetation or something on the surface, but you see the extent of that lake now. That is due to humans overexploiting and overusing the water sources that feed Lake Chad and is creating an increasingly arid area. Notice the loss of green out here and the increasing desert around it. Okay. Over here on the right, we have a map of the areas around the planet that are at greatest risk of desertification. The white areas are already desert, so they are not at risk, or they're ocean, or they're ice. But in the temperate regions, they're already desert, temperate and tropical. They're already desert, so it doesn't really matter. Maybe not up here in Montana. I'm not sure what's going on with that white region, but it's very low anyway. The red areas very high, so we see that most of the western United States, very high risk of desertification. Anything that's bordering a desert, such as in Africa or Central Asia, is also very high, also bordering the Australian outback. Right? So there's a lot of area on the planet that is at risk of desertification. So I mentioned weathering and erosion several times already. Weathering, I want to point out, is breaking down rock or altering that rock by chemical or physical means in place. There's little or no movement when you talk about weathering. Okay, just breaking rock down into smaller and smaller pieces or chemically altering it. Okay, erosion though, again, is picking up rock or soil from one place, either by wind or water, and that wind or water depositing it in another place. Okay, so it includes both that picking up, the transportation, and the deposition of it. It is important to note that erosion isn't a 100% bad thing. Erosion is a very natural process, and it's going to happen whether we want it to or not. And erosion does, take mountains and erode them down over time and create fertile soils in those valleys of those mountains. So it's not a completely bad process. It's just that the rate of erosion that we're seeing today, as well as the erosion of topsoils around the planet, is a huge cause for concern. So some of the consequences of soil erosion, one of those is pollution and poor water quality. So as those soils erode, especially due to water mechanisms or water action, it takes that sediment into those bodies of water, which can pollute them. It does make them more turbid, meaning that they are more murky, and those soils could carry pollutants such as pesticides or fertilizers and heavy metals from human activities, right? So all of those can be deposited into bodies of water, lakes, rivers, oceans due to erosion, right? Erosion can increase or causes mudslides and landslides, which are not, happy events typically. Could increase local flooding by depositing large material in the rivers, and it could cause soil degradation like we've been talking about, so the loss of topsoil and the soil nutrients in that topsoil, and then the reduction of ecosystem services. So again, we haven't talked about ecosystem services yet, but some of those ecosystem services include storing carbon in those soils, filtering water that is going to either a surface water or an aquifer, providing habitat and nutrient cycling. And this concept of soil erosion and the negative effects of soil erosion are not new. In fact, over 2,300 years ago, or about 2,300 years ago, Plato talked about the negative effects of soil erosion, which I'll let you guys pause this right now and read. So even Plato, back in the 3rd or 4th century BC, knew about the negative effects of erosion. So let's talk about some of the ways that we can fix erosion, or some of the ways that we can prevent erosion. The first one is crop rotation. Okay, so this is where you're going to have one plot of land. So you have one plot of land here, and the first year you grow one of these crops. Say that you grow a root crop your first year. Okay, so you grow all your roots, your carrots that year. The next year, you're going to grow fruits because they need a different set of nutrients from that soil, and you're going to allow some of those nutrients that the roots took up to return to the soil. Okay. The third year, you're going to grow leaf vegetables like lettuce. They need yet another set of nutrients. And then the fourth year, you're going to grow legumes, which fix nitrogen back into the soil. So they fix nitrogen into the soil. And then you go back to your root vegetables. And you keep doing that in the same field year after year after year. All right, season after season after season. And when I say season, I mean growing season. Like in the northern hemisphere, that'd be summer. Okay. If you want to add animals to that, you can add animals to it as well. So maybe the animals go through and they eat the remains of the crops that you harvested. They just eat the parts that you didn't harvest. And then they fertilize the field with what comes out the back end of those animals. Okay. That is kind of like rotational grazing, but rotational grazing kind of has its own definition, which we'll get into later in the school year, which is more about putting animals onto different fields all the time. We'll get to it later. All right. Those legumes, again, they fix nitrogen to the soil. They will add nutrients to the soil. Animals will add nutrients to the soil through their dung. And other crops like buckwheat, for example, will add different nutrients to the soil. In buckwheat's case, I believe it's phosphorus that they'll add to the soil. Okay. one of the key things about crop rotation is that you always keep plants on the soil. Those roots are going to hold the soil together and prevent erosion. Okay, so you see that on the right here, or sorry, on the left here, we have a field that has been left fallow. Fallow meaning that no crops are on there, so they have harvested what looks like corn, maybe sunflowers, but I think corn, and they've left that field just bare, right? The dead stalks there, but that's about it. Those bare spots are very susceptible to wind and water erosion, plus it produces nothing. It's much better to put a legume on there like field peas, and the field peas are not the peas that you eat, that you buy from the grocery store, but they're peas that you could feed to chickens or pigs, and you can gain a yield from that. You can sell those to chicken or pig farmers, cattle farmers, plus it reduces your erosion as well. All right, because all of the roots from those are holding the soil together, plus those legumes are fixing nitrogen and adding nitrogen into your soil. All right, so crop rotation is one of the best ways to prevent soil erosion. Another way to prevent soil erosion or to eliminate soil erosion is eliminating plowing. So either reducing or eliminating plowing. One of those methods is what we call no-till agriculture. Plowing has its place, and plowing has its time, and you need to plow in the correct way if you're going to plow for your soil and climate conditions. But in general, whenever you plow, it's going to disturb the O and the A horizon, and it's going to allow it to dry up, and you can have some erosion from that. Okay, there's different types of plowing for different soil types and different climates that we don't really need to get into this course, but plowing can have its place. But if you can figure out how to grow your crops without plowing at all, you're going to leave your O horizon intact, you're going to leave your A horizon intact, and you're not going to disturb it at all. You're not going to break up the fungal hyphae that are living in there. You're not going to kill any earthworms or disturb the soil in any other way. All right. If you do plow and you overplow and you have poor technique that are not suited to your area, you can end up in a Dust Bowl-like situation, which is exactly what happened with the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Right? So that was all brought on by the wrong type of plowing multiple times a year, and plowing at the wrong time of year when they did plow those multiple times, plus overplanting, lack of crop rotation, and then most notably drought, all came together to form that perfect storm of the Dust Bowl. All right. You guys don't really need to know the history behind it, but reducing plowing definitely can eliminate soil erosion in a given area. If you must plow, then you should plow with contour plowing. Contour plowing, you'll notice with the hill on the left, we plow in subsequent circles following the contour or the topography of that landscape, right? So we're just following the curves of that land and making sure that our plowing lines, our furrows, are perpendicular to the rate or to the direction of water flow. All right, so water flow is going to flow off this direction, but if we have all of these bumps here, they are going to intercept the water and they're not going to allow water to flow. Rather than having your furrows facing in like this, which is going to allow water to run down between those furrows and to pool here at the bottom and erode all of that away. Okay, so the left is an example of contour plowing, and then on the right is not contour plowing and is to be avoided. All right. If you were in a mountainous or hilly landscape, you could, instead of contour plowing, create terraces. And terraces are great because they create sections of flat land that can hold water and prevent erosion, because that water is not moving. It's not going to move the sediments that are in it. There are some disadvantages to this. The most notable disadvantage is that it's very difficult to get machinery, heavy machinery, into these different terraces. So most of the labor has to be done by hand or by animal labor. But it's a great way to reduce erosion or to eliminate erosion completely. In fact, it's so good at eliminating erosion that you're actually going to build up soil in all of these terraces rather than have it erode away. So you're building soil. Another way to prevent erosion is through shelter beds. This is primarily for wind erosion. So all of these lines of trees may be delineating fields, but what they are also doing is they are stopping wind from moving through here and eroding that soil away. All right. So in this case, it looks like they're mostly delineated in different fields, but they can be planted intentionally to prevent wind erosion. So say that you have a large farm, you could put a shelter bed over in the prevailing direction of the wind. So if the wind is coming from the east, you could put a row of trees over here on the east side of your field, and then maybe your crops, and then maybe another row of trees in the middle, and then a row of crops again. And those two lines of trees will protect your fields from wind erosion. All right, and then the next one is basically mulching. So in nature, you're typically going to have, at least in vegetated areas, you're typically going to have natural mulches, whether that is dead grasses, dead leaves, dead branches, dead organic matter in one way or another. We need to replicate that as much as possible in nature. So what we need to do whenever we disturb soils, especially in all of these are construction sites except for the one garden here on the top right, we need to prevent soil erosion by adding some material on that soil to hold it down, which is a mulch. Okay, so living plants hold soils down with their roots. Mulches will protect soils from movement. And then we have some other things like these straw blankets here on the left. We have rock mulch here in the middle. And then we have these straw wattles that you probably see all the time at construction sites that are preventing erosion as well. So say that erosion does occur right here and soil starts to move down the hill, it's going to get caught by the straw wattle, which is staked into the ground, and it's going to build up soil right there rather than letting it erode down. And then this green stuff, you've probably seen this green stuff as well. What they'll do is they'll take a biodegradable screen. Sometimes it's nylon, but most of the time it's biodegradable nowadays. And they create this this net, and this green stuff is seeds that have been sprayed with a fertilizer and a chemical inoculant to allow them to grow, and then you'll have plants growing up here. From that seed. That net is holding the soil down right now, and then that seed is going to germinate, and the roots of those plants are going to hold the soil down afterwards. So you'll see that all the time at construction sites. Both those, the straw wattle and those I don't even know what they're called, the seed net things. You'll see those all the time. All right, and then the last slide, just the benefits of mulch. This is a little bit of a sidetrack, but and beyond just preventing erosion, mulch does a lot of things. Mulch insulates the soil so that you don't get soil temperature swings as drastic as you would normally. So it keeps the soil relatively cool in summer and relatively warm in winter. Right? Reduces evaporation and keeps water in the soil. It reduces erosion. It acts as a slow release fertilizer as all of this organic matter breaks down and enters the soil, becomes part of the O and A horizons. And it also provides habitat for a lot of the beneficial organisms in the soil, like earthworms and beneficial microorganisms. All right, so the learning objectives. Like I said, this essential knowledge is deviously simple compared to all the stuff that we had to unpack. So soils are formed when parent material is weathered, transported, and deposited. Okay, that transported and deposited part, that is our erosion. Okay, so that parent material breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces, our sands, silts, and clays. Organic matter is added to it, creating soil, and then that soil can erode. Okay. Soils are typically categorized by those horizons. So again, the horizons O, A, E, B, C, and R. Okay. Based off of their composition, their amount of organic material in there, and their physical and chemical properties. Okay, and then soil erosion. So soils can be eroded by wind or water. Protecting those soils is critical. So it improves water quality, protects water quality, allows soils to filter that water to either surface flow like a spring or an aquifer, which is groundwater. All right. Hope you guys learned something, and I will see you on class. Bye.